Devil May Cry 3 Dante's Awakening is a hack and slash character action game developed and published by Capcom and released exclusively for the PlayStation 2 in 2005. A year later, the game got a re-release for PS2 and PC in the form of Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition. This version of the game added several new features, such as the ability to play through the entire game as Virgil, as well as a new checkpoint system, which made the game considerably easier to complete. This is the version I will be playing for this review. Devil May Cry 3 is actually a prequel to the original game, making it a great jumping on point for newcomers to the series. However, it should also be noted that by starting with 3, it will probably be even more difficult for new players to go back and play Devil May Cry 1 afterwards, since 3 is such a massive leap forward in terms of combat complexity and overall game design, so I will leave the choice of which game to start with up to you. Both Devil May Cry 3 Dante's Awakening and its Special Edition received very positive reviews from critics. However, some critics were put off by the almost cruel difficulty level in the original release. You see, Capcom were apparently worried about Americans renting Devil May Cry 3 for a weekend, finishing it, and then never touching it again. So in an effort to hopefully raise the game's sales in America, Capcom basically forced the developers to raise the difficulty level for US players. So essentially, America's normal difficulty was actually Japan's hard difficulty, America's hard difficulty was Japan's very hard difficulty, and so on. This jump in difficulty would cause many players in the West to simply quit playing the game entirely before they ever got to experience its true genius. So, I guess you could say that Devil May Cry 3 Dante's Awakening was the Dark Souls of—
Shut the fuck up, you c***!
Maybe a controversial opinion, but Devil May Cry is actually one of the few series where I'd recommend not listening to critic reviews. I mean, don't get me wrong, critics are entitled to their opinion of course, but DMC really is a series where you get back what you put in. For example, if you are simply going to mash the triangle button throughout the entire game without bothering to learn the intricacies of the combat system, it is very likely you are going to have a subpar experience. However, if you really take the time to learn the deeper combat mechanics, like jump cancelling, weapon switching, pause combos, and taunting, you are probably going to come away very impressed by Devil May Cry 3, even today. I don't believe most professional video game journalists working today have the time to truly learn what makes these games so special. IGN's 4 out of 10 verdict for one of the greatest action games ever made should be testament to that. Basically, my point is that when it comes to complex action games like Devil May Cry, God Hand, or Bayonetta, you are better off listening to the fans rather than the critics. So for this review, I decided to use the HD collection of the first 3 Devil May Cry games that Capcom originally released back on the PS3 and 360. Thankfully, since then, this collection has also been made available for Steam, Xbox One, PS4 and Nintendo Switch. While the HD collection is a very solid way to play these games today, you may encounter a few graphical oddities while playing, due to the fact that these games were never meant to be played in widescreen. It's also worth noting that with the Nintendo Switch release of DMC3, you are actually able to switch between all of Dante's styles on the fly. However, since the game was never designed with this feature in mind, it feels rather overpowered, and as such, I will not be reviewing this version of the game, even though in many ways it is the definitive version of DMC3 and the best way to play the game today. They even added local co-op to the Bloody Palace mode, which is so damn fun to mess around in. Anyways, for this video I'll be playing the PS4 version of the HD collection, which is also fully playable on PS5. Speaking of the HD collection, this compilation not only includes Devil May Cry 3, but Devil May Cry 1 as well. Devil May Cry 1 was my introduction to the series, and it was awesome back in the day. Unfortunately, with the massive progress this genre has seen over the last 2 decades, it's quite difficult to revisit today, especially if you've never played it before. Compared to later games in the series, its combat system feels incredibly limited, You can't switch between melee weapons on the fly, there's no style switching, or a style system at all in fact. The move list with each weapon leaves a lot to be desired. You can't even jump cancel. Well, technically you can when using the shotgun, but I'm fairly sure this is a bug and was never actually supposed to be in the original game. And don't get me started on the atrocious camera and platforming. Devil May Cry 1 is also very weird tonally. Not only is the game trying to be an over-the-top action romp, but it also occasionally tries to be a horror game too. There are quite a few creepy moments in the game that, while effective at making the player feel uneasy at times, do not meld well at all with the crazy action on display. There is a reason for this, however, and I'm sorry for repeating the same fucking story you've all heard a million times before, but I feel the need to point it out for people unfamiliar with the series. So originally, Devil May Cry was supposed to be Resident Evil 4. That's why DMC1 has so many fixed camera angles and creepy enemies. When Resi creator Shinji Mikami saw what director Hideki Kamiya had created, he was incredibly impressed. However, he also felt that the over-the-top hack-and-slash action wasn't appropriate for a Resident Evil game. Resident Evil was a survival horror series, not an action series, and so... And...
Put those damn things down.
And so, Shinji Mikami asked Hideki Kamiya to consider creating a new IP from what he and his team had developed so far. Thus, Devil May Cry was born. This is why the original Devil May Cry feels a lot more like a Resident Evil game than later entries in the series. More importantly, however, DMC1 introduced us all to one of the greatest protagonists in gaming. I remember replaying DMC1 recently, and still being surprised by how cool Dante is in the original game.
Are you the human, the son of Sparta who challenges the darkness for this?
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
You know what? Dante's actually pretty cool.
Then I go and spoil it all by saying something stupid like,
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
Just keep moving, don't make eye contact.
Okay, so DMC1 Dante is admittedly a bit cringy, but he's also incredibly endearing. It's very hard not to want to root for him. Anyways, despite all my issues with DMC1, I just can't help but still love this game. There is something really cozy about the game, for want of a better word. The castle is really well designed and fun to explore. There's some mildly challenging puzzles to solve, and the boss fights are all really memorable. Mainly because you're forced to fight most of them 3 times. There's just something about DMC1 that still makes me want to replay it every couple of years. I even have a figurine of DMC1 Dante that my brother got me for Christmas one year. Look how cool he is. He's ready to take a kick out of crime. Hiya! I can cut all this out later. So yeah, Devil May Cry 1 was an excellent first entry in the character action series, and is still worth a playthrough today, assuming you can deal with some outdated gameplay mechanics. Unfortunately, after this, Capcom kinda shit the bed with the second entry. So Devil May Cry 2 is considered by most DMC fans to be the worst in the series, and yes, it is, but I can still appreciate what the devs were going for. I remember back when I first played the game, thinking it was so cool that Dante could now run up walls and do all these crazy stunts in the air with his handguns. I found the combat enjoyable and thought Dante was cool, despite him now apparently suffering from anemic aphasia for some reason. I remember completing DMC2 and being so confused as to why so many people disliked the game. Revisiting it now though, yeah, I was a silly cunt. DMC2 is horseshit. The first issue are these big fuck off environments. In DMC1 and 3 respectively, environments are mostly closed in and claustrophobic, so that you are almost always within attacking distance of an enemy, which makes it easier to keep your style meter up. In DMC2 though, enemies are usually miles away from each other, making it almost impossible to perform any extravagant combos. You need to use your gun all the time in this game, or you will lose your style ranking. Speaking of the guns in this game, I've seen a lot of people claim that the firearms are way too overpowered in DMC2, to the point where they almost make the melee weapons completely irrelevant. But that can't possibly be the case, can it? Okay, well I know for a fact that the bosses are difficult and wouldn't be vulnerable against such cheap tactics.
What the hell is that?
Right, so that was Devil May Cry 2. To be fair to the developers, I've heard that they were apparently given a very short amount of time to develop DMC2. Also, the game's original director left midway through the project, at which point legendary game designer Hideki Itsuno was tasked with writing the ship. Itsuno has created many beloved video game franchises during his career, such as Rival Schools and Power Stone. His extensive knowledge in regards to fighting games made Capcom believe he was the right person to take control of the series. However, he was brought onto the team just as the game's development deadline was approaching, and he was given so little time to fix all the fuck-ups the previous director had left in his wake, that all he and his team could realistically do was patch up the game as well as possible with the remaining time, and hope that was enough. While it was a valiant effort, DMC2 ultimately released to mixed reviews. Surprisingly, however, the game ended up selling very well, to the point where Capcom even greenlit a sequel. Itsuno wanted one more chance to prove to Capcom that he was the right man to get this series back on track. And holy shit, did he ever accomplish that task.
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock.
A game like Devil May Cry 3 really shouldn't exist. Usually when a game releases that is as bad as Devil May Cry 2 was, you are unlikely to ever hear from that franchise again. But Capcom still had faith in the Devil May Cry series, and so greenlit one last sequel. This was all or nothing for Itsuno and his crew. They had to make the best game possible, or Capcom would have no choice but to shelf the DMC series for good. Somehow they pulled off one of the greatest comeback stories in video game history. It's impossible to overstate just how much of an improvement DMC3 was over its predecessors. It had a brilliant story that told an engaging and sometimes even emotional story. Fuck's sake.
Guess what? You're bloated.
It told an engaging and sometimes emotional story that pulled on the heartstrings more than any previous action game ever had before. It had an unforgettable cast of characters, including many people's favourite character of the entire series, Virgil. Combat was massively overhauled when compared to the previous games. Dante could now switch between 2 melee weapons and 2 firearms on the fly. Jump cancelling became a major mechanic in the game, allowing players to stay in the air almost indefinitely with enough skill. Devil May Cry 3 was also the first game in the series to introduce players to the style system. Players could choose from one of 4 styles before each mission. If you were a newcomer to the series, you could choose Trickster, which allows players to easily dodge enemy attacks with a simple push of the circle button. It also allows you to pull off some sick moves like this. Swordmaster is my preferred style, since it massively increases the amount of moves Dante can perform with each weapon. If you briefly have a brain aneurysm and accidentally select Gunslinger, you can use the Gunslinger style, which allows Dante to perform some rather extravagant moves with his firearms. And finally there's Royal Guard, which is basically a souped up block mechanic. I'm personally not very skilled at using Royal Guard, but if you really take the time to master this style, Dante basically becomes untouchable and will decimate everything in his path. As I mentioned earlier, Devil May Cry 3 is a prequel to the original game, and follows a younger Dante as he attempts to stop his brother from unleashing havoc on the world. At the beginning of the game, Dante is chilling out in his shop, which he has yet to pick a name for, when a man enters, claiming to know who Dante is.
The toilet's in the back.
Is your name Dante, son of Sparta?
Where did you hear that?
From your brother. He sent this invitation for you. Please accept it.
Invitation, huh?
Devil May Cry 3 really wastes no time in showing off just how much cooler and badass this new Dante is, even if it sometimes feels like the developers are trying a little too hard to make us believe this guy isn't actually a massive dork. Okay, so that's enough of whatever the fuck that was. The cutscenes in Devil May Cry 3 really are something else though, and I watch all of them every time I play the game. Even when there's no dialogue or story development in a cutscene, the devs will still throw in a badass action sequence for the hell of it. I mean, just take this scene for example.
Welcome back.
Like, it's just a meaningless scene of ladies shooting some demons that has no impact on the plot whatsoever, and yet it's still one of the coolest fucking things I've ever seen. Anyways, after this opening cutscene ends, we are brought to the Mission 1 menu, where you can either start the mission immediately or access a customization menu, where you can kit out Dante with whatever weapons are in his arsenal, or use red orbs to buy items from the shop. Since this footage is from my most recent hard playthrough, you will essentially be viewing a New Game Plus version of this game, which means you might see footage where I'm using a weapon or style before I should even have access to it. In my opinion, the initial playthrough of a Devil May Cry game is always the most tedious. You haven't unlocked your full arsenal yet, and you have barely any moves to play around with. It's once you've completed the game for the first time that the fun really begins. Mission 1 is a great introduction to the game, since you are in a confined area with loads of low-level Reaper enemies, which allows you to start to get to grips with the combat system. Combat in Devil May Cry 3 can initially feel a little archaic, especially when compared to more modern action games that basically play themselves for you. But once you get to grips with it, destroying demons stylistically will become second nature to you. For example, Pressing the triangle button 3 times with Rebellion will cause Dante to perform a simplistic 3-hit combo. However, if you pause for a brief moment after pressing the triangle button the first time, and then press the triangle button again, you will perform an entirely different combo. This is called a pause combo. Locking onto an enemy with the R1 button will also give you access to even more moves for Dante to perform. So while locked onto an enemy, pushing forward while pressing the triangle button will cause Dante to lunge towards his enemy with his sword, while pushing back will have Dante launch the enemy into the air. You might be wondering why it's so important to use all these combos when it's quite possible to complete the entire game on normal by simply mashing the triangle button over and over again. Well, that's because of the style meter. You see, when you perform combos in DMC3, you will begin to fill the style meter. This meter starts off at dope, then increases to crazy, then blast, and so forth. Mixing up your combos helps fill the stylus meter quicker, but using the same combo over and over will actually reduce the style meter. So if you want that triple S rank on the style gauge, you will have to mix up your playstyle considerably. The style system is one of the DMC series' greatest accomplishments, and really encouraged players to learn the intricacies of each combat system, unlike all the other action games around at the time that simply encouraged button mashing to win. There is admittedly a ton to learn with this combat system, but because of that, the skill ceiling is almost limitless. Once you start feeling comfortable with the basics, you can start implementing Swordmaster techniques into your combo. For example, if you press the circle button while using Rebellion and the Swordmaster style, Dante will perform Shredder, a move that is fantastic for easily launching enemies into the air. And once you've got the hang of that, you can try moving on to more advanced techniques, like jump cancelling, which will keep you and your enemy suspended in mid-air and out of the way of any nearby foes. On-the-fly weapon switching also allows skilled players to pull off some truly mind-blowing combos. When you add all of these mechanics together, it's no wonder that so many people are still experimenting and fucking around with this combat system nearly 2 decades later.
I can already tell. Looks like this is gonna be one hell of a party!
Anyways, once you've completed this first mission, you will be ranked on your performance. Players are ranked on how quickly they completed a mission, how many orbs they collected, how stylish they were taking care of enemies, how much damage they took, and how many items they used. You are then given a final ranking based on those parameters. Honestly, DMC3's method of ranking the player's performance is one of the harshest of the entire series. There really is no space for fuck-ups if you want that S rank. And while I have platinumed this game, I was only really able to S rank all missions on easy difficulty. If you plan on getting all the trophies or achievements with this game, I'd recommend you do the same. Mission 2 is very similar to the first. A small area where you are forced to take out over a dozen low level enemies. However, this time they mix it up a little by introducing these little shits who explode when you either shoot them or get too close to them. Usually these guys aren't much of an issue to deal with, but sometimes you're given practically no space to take them out safely. A rather cheap enemy, honestly. For the most part though, Devil May Cry 3's enemies are fantastically designed, posing a meaningful challenge to the player, while still being fun to combo and fuck around with. However, towards the end of the game, these fun enemy types are frequently replaced with some of the most boring foes of the entire series. For example, Soul Eaters are these little octopus-looking creatures who can't be attacked head-on, since they vanish when Dante looks directly at them, kind of like the boos from Super Mario. So instead, you have to look away from them and pretend they don't exist, which oddly enough is how many women behave around me when we're on a date. Anyways, once they're visible again, you can quickly lock onto them and kill them with a firearm. Usually I wouldn't spend so much time droning on about a single enemy type, but these guys are indicative of a far larger issue with Devil May Cry 3. You can't really look stylish while fighting many of the enemy types in this game. Take these shield guys for example. All you can really do with them is hop over them and attack them from the rear. You can't launch them into the air or really even combo them, since they die in about 3 hits. As much as I love most of the enemy types in DMC3, I have to wonder how guys like this even made it into a game about dispatching your foes as stylishly as possible. What's cool is that DMC3 includes a bestiary, so that you can learn even more about all the enemies and bosses in this world. Honestly, I'm so obsessed with some of the enemy designs in this game, that I just wish these entries weren't so brief. I mean, there's so many things I want to learn about these guys.
Did they ever just like fucking run around nude and you see like one of their big old fucking hairy nuts?
Anyways, Mission 2 was a fun time overall, and another area that's great for getting to grips with the combat mechanics. However, this mission ends with the first real difficulty spike of the game. So once you've cleared the area of enemies, the game's first mini-boss appears, the Hell Vanguard. I remember this guy absolutely wrecking me the first time I played the game, but honestly, he's not too bad once you get the hang of him. Just remember to mash the triangle button to counter his sight attacks, and then roll out of the way when it's safe to do so. Once you have defeated the Hell Vanguard, a massive tower emerges from underneath the ground. On top of the tower, we see Dante's brother Virgil. Virgil is after Dante's amulet, for reasons yet unknown to us. What this scene does an excellent job at is showing us what an absolute badass Virgil is. Despite the player having likely just struggled to survive against the Hell Vanguard, Virgil destroys the demon with a single strike. From Mission 3 onwards, the game really begins to hit its stride, and it becomes almost impossible to put the controller down. Also, a cool little Easter egg that a lot of people don't know about is that the number of each mission actually appears in the opening cutscene of said mission. So for example, in Mission 3, Lady uses her motorcycle to kill some Reapers behind her, who then fall to the ground in the shape of a tree, while Mission 7 shows Dante rubbing some blood from his forehead onto a nearby wall, which then drips down in the shape of a 7. It's a really silly addition admittedly, but it adds to the fucking charm of DMC3 so much that I couldn't imagine the game without them now. Anyways, Mission 3 features an amazing fight in a strip club that is absolute carnage and endlessly enjoyable to replay. This fight is followed by the first real boss fight of the game, Cerberus.
Leave now, mortal! The likes of you are forbidden in this land! You who are powerless are not worthy to set foot here!
Wow, I've never seen a talking mutt before. You know, in a dog show, you'd definitely take first place.
You ugly human make a mockery of me!
Easy, Fido. How about I take you out for a walk? Come on, puppy. Let's go.
You'll regret this, you worm!
It's showtime. Come on.
I'd imagine for most people who played this game in the West during its original release, this is where they decided to throw in the towel. Cerberus is an absolute nightmare to kill, especially if you don't know what you are doing. You essentially need to shoot the ice off its body before attempting to melee it. It isn't so bad once you figure out its patterns, but DMC3 is not going to hold your hand and explain to you each boss's weakness. You need to figure that shit out for yourself. Speaking of the bosses, DMC3 arguably has the best set of boss fights in the entire series. Some are admittedly a bit shit, like Leviathan and Arkham, but most are fantastic and really play to the game's strengths. I also love how most of the bosses require some degree of thought in order to beat them optimally. For example, Nevin uses a lot of electrical attacks that can be an absolute nightmare to avoid, so using the Trickster style is ideal when fighting her. On the other hand, Leviathan is easier to kill when using Swordmaster, since you can continuously jump cancel in order to avoid any enemies on the ground, while also doing massive damage in the process. But of course, I can't talk about boss fights in DMC3 without mentioning Agni and Rudra. This is one of the most difficult fights in the entire game, but fuck if it isn't also one of the most exhilarating too. Agni and Rudra will relentlessly attack Dante, dealing massive damage with each blow they land. The only way to really have any chance of surviving is by trying to separate them to take them out one at a time. But killing one of the brothers also comes with its own problems. Once you have defeated either Agni or Rudra, the other sibling will take his dead brother's weapon to become even more powerful. So the ideal plan is to whittle down both Agni and Rudra's health until they are both on the precipice of death. This way you can kill both of the brothers before either of them have the chance to power up. Honestly, Agni and Rudra is easily one of the greatest boss fights of all time, and has clearly inspired other boss fights still held in high regard today. I also love the cutscene that plays once you defeat them.
Wait! Yes, wait! We have been waiting for a long time! Yes, a very long time. For someone stronger than us. Someone who can control us. My name is Agni. And my name is Rudra. You shall take us with you. We could be a great help to you.
Okay, but on one condition.
What is it? Name it!
No talking.
Fair enough. As you wish. Impressive.
No talking. Good.
So as you could see from that cutscene, once you defeat a boss, Dante receives that boss's weapon. So for example, upon defeating Cerberus, you will receive a pair of ice-covered nunchucks, while defeating Nevin will get you a demonic electric guitar. DMC3's weapons are all very distinct from each other, and are all a blast to toy around with. Cerberus is probably my favourite weapon in the game, since it's probably the most stylish weapon to dispatch enemies with. It's super flashy, but isn't very useful for dealing with large groups of enemies. Agni and Rudra, on the other hand, are twin blades that are great for crowd control and do a lot of damage, but their attack speed is quite slow. Then there's Nevin, the demonic guitar that kills enemies through the power of music. Much like when I use an actual guitar though, I have no fucking idea what I'm doing when wielding this weapon, and just end up making a fool of myself. How the fuck do you use this thing? Alright, I'm gonna have to check out the move list. Tune up. Press triangle while on the ground. Keep the left stick neutral and press triangle while in tune up mode. What? Tap left on the left stick and press triangle while in tune up mode. Finally, there's Beowulf. These are gauntlet weapons that allow Dante to use his fists and feet to damage enemies. They are a blast to use, and are also incredibly powerful. It's also a good weapon to use when you want to get the hang of jump cancelling. Dante's campaign alone will probably take you about 8 hours to complete the first time through, but there is a ridiculous amount of replay value in DMC3 Special Edition, especially if you plan to 100% everything. Once you complete the game on normal difficulty, you will unlock hard difficulty. After that there's also very hard and Dante Must Die difficulties to play through. Once you get to Dante Must Die, the game really stops fucking around and will kick your teeth in if you make a single mistake. Enemies are more plentiful and will do a whole lot more damage. Also, enemies can activate Devil Trigger on this difficulty, which makes them far more resilient to attacks. Honestly, Dante Must Die difficulty was a miserable experience for me, and if I wasn't going for the Platinum Trophy, I honestly wouldn't have bothered. I enjoy a challenge, but this is taking the piss. Avoid playing on Dante Must Die unless you are a completionist. Besides higher difficulties, there is a wealth of other content to unlock, such as concept art and behind the scenes footage that really shows how above and beyond the team went to create the insane cutscenes featured in this game. There is also Bloody Palace, which is basically an arena mode where you are forced to face off against thousands of foes in order to reach the top floor of the palace. It's great fun and is a useful feature for when you want to practice your combos or simply grind for red orbs. As I mentioned earlier, you can play through this mode with a friend in the Switch version. It's a fantastic feature, and I really hope the co-op eventually gets ported to other consoles and PC. The best extra feature in Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, however, is the option to play as Virgil. Virgil is an absolute powerhouse in DMC3. Unlike Dante, Virgil can switch between 3 melee weapons on the fly, which leads to some insane combo potential. And despite him only having one style and one ranged weapon, I arguably had more fun playing as him than I did Dante. What can I say? Virgil is a badass. Unfortunately, while I can appreciate the amount of work the developers must have had to put in to get Virgil playable in DMC3, he still has no exclusive levels or bosses of his own. He gets an incredible opening cutscene, but after that, you might as well be playing as Dante for all the differences there are. Still, Virgil is a really neat extra, and his toolkit makes for a fun playthrough. I don't have time to go in depth about DMC3's wonderful story, but what I will say is that I fell in love with practically every character in this game by the time the credits rolled, except Arkham. And Chester, of course.
I see. Thanks. You still piss me off, though.
Dante and Virgil's brotherly bond is so heartwarming to witness during the few moments you get to see it, which makes it all the more upsetting when they are unable to put their differences aside and end their constant dueling. Instead of feeling victorious, I was genuinely upset after beating the final boss, and once I saw Dante's reaction to losing a loved one, I was almost moved to tears myself. The game is also endlessly quotable.
Well, this is my kind of rain. No wonder the sky looks so funny today.
Let me go!
Let you go? But it would be a waste if you ended up as just a pretty stain.
Look, brother, it's been ages, but we finally have company. I see that. We must entertain our guest. You're right. We have to be gracious hosts. What should we do? How do I know? We need to come up with something. Brother, our guest is sighing. Sigh? What is sigh? Well, a sigh is when...
Enough already! I'll try it your way for once. Remember what we used to say? Jackpot.
If you want to watch a deeper analysis of the game's story, I highly recommend checking out Codec Entry's fantastic video on the game. I'll have a link to it in the description. It's crazy to me how well Devil May Cry 3 holds up nearly 20 years later. Even if the game was released today, I'd still imagine it would be received very positively. In fact, the Switch version was only released a few years ago, and critics still loved it. It just gets practically everything right. An excellent story, a wonderful cast of characters that people are still enamored with today, and possibly the greatest action gameplay ever created. Sure, Devil May Cry 4 and 5 may be more complex from a combat perspective, but even they can't match DMC3's perfect pacing and genre-defining boss fights. If you have never played a Devil May Cry game before, I highly recommend starting with this one. It's canonically the first game in the series, so you don't need to worry about missing out on important story stuff. Plus, its gameplay is far more complex than the first two entries, but not as overwhelming as DMC 4 or 5, so it's an ideal starting point for newcomers. Devil May Cry 3 is still a genre-defining masterpiece.